To understand why Elizabeth I spent years trying to ruin Katherine Grey's life, you first have to understand the messy legal leftovers of Henry VIII. Before he died, Henry essentially wrote a last will and testament for the entire country. In it, he gave a massive middle finger to the Scottish royals and decided that if his own children died childless, the crown should go to the descendants of his younger sister. Very on brand, honestly. Enter Katherine Grey, the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's impulsive, beautiful little sister, who was widely known to be his favourite sibling, even naming his first daughter, Mary I, after her. What this meant was that Catherine was a great-granddaughter of the very first Tudor king, Henry VII. And in the eyes of the law, she wasn't just a distant relative. She was the Goldilocks of heirs. She was close enough to the throne to be legitimate, but just far enough away to be a perfect tool for anyone who thought Elizabeth was taking too long to produce a son of her own. But there was a ghost in Catherine's closet. Her older sister was Lady Jane Grey, the girl Mary I famously had executed after only 9 days on the throne. Being a Grey in 16th century London was a bit like carrying a briefcase with a ticking bomb inside. You were either destined for a palace or a scaffold, and there was very little room in between. So Elizabeth kept Catherine as a lady of the bedchamber, which sounds prestigious, but was actually a form of polite house arrest. She wanted Catherine close enough to smell her perfume, and far enough from any men who might want to put a crown or a baby on her. Elizabeth knew that an unmarried heir was a threat, but a married heir with a son? That was a replacement. So, when Catherine managed to slip away to marry Edward Seymour in a secret, hurried ceremony, she wasn't just being a romantic. She was playing with fire in a room full of gunpowder. She took the most dangerous bloodline in England and handed it over to the Seymours, a family that collected scandals like other people collected stamps. Lest we forget Elizabeth's own scandal with Edward's father, Thomas Seymour. It was the ultimate betrayal, wrapped in a wedding ring, and Elizabeth was never going to forgive her for it. But how exactly do you pull off a royal wedding when your cousin is the most powerful and most paranoid woman in England? You don't do it in a cathedral with fanfares and lace. Oh no. You do it with a fake toothache and a very quiet walk through the mud. In the winter of 1560, the court moved to Whitehall. While the Queen was preparing for a day of hunting, Catherine saw her opening. She claimed she was suffering from a debilitating, throbbing toothache, an excuse so mundane and miserable that no one thought to double-check it. So, as the royal hunting party rode out into the crisp morning air, Catherine slipped out of the palace's back doors, her silk hem dragging through the London slush. She wasn't heading to a physician. She was heading to a small, nondescript house in Cannon Row, where Edward Seymour was waiting with a priest he'd essentially snatched off the street. The ceremony was nothing like the sprawling, golden spectacles the Tudors were known for. There was no music, no witnesses except for Edward's sister, Jane, and the light came from a few sputtering tallow candles rather than 1,000 wax tapers. In that cold, hurried room, the statutory heir and the ambitious nephew exchanged vows that were legally binding and politically lethal. They thought they were being clever. They thought that if they just kept their heads down and their secrets tight, they could wait for the right moment to tell the Queen. But the Seymours had a historical blind spot when it came to timing. By the time the hunting party returned to the palace that evening, the trap was already set. Not by Elizabeth, but by biology. because a secret marriage in the Tudor court only stays secret until the morning sickness begins. The secret held for 8 months. 8 months of heavy gowns, tightening corsets, and a growing, terrifying knot in Catherine's stomach that had nothing to do with nerves. And by August, she had finally run out of time to play the part of the chaste maiden. The bump was undeniable, and the only person who could save her from the Queen's wrath was the one man who had the Queen's ear, Robert Dudley. Let's set the scene, shall we? It's the middle of the night in Ipswich. The temporary court is a labyrinth of shifting shadows, draughty tapestries, and the rhythmic, guttural snoring of exhausted guards. Katherine creeps through the darkness toward the one room no unmarried woman should ever enter. The bedchamber of Robert Dudley, the Queen's favourite. In any other context, this would be a scandal that would ruin her reputation forever. But Katherine wasn't looking for a tryst. She was looking for a miracle. She wakes Dudley from a deep sleep, and before he can even process the sight of the Queen's heir standing over his bed, she collapses. Shaking, her voice cracking in the silence, she confesses everything. The secret marriage to Edward Seymour, the vanished priest, and the most dangerous truth of all, that she was 8 months pregnant with a child who could, by law, replace the Queen. Dudley, a man who lived and breathed the dangerous politics of Elizabeth's heart, was instantly wide awake and instantly horrified. He knew that by telling him this, Katherine had essentially handed him a loaded pistol and asked him not to pull the trigger. He also knew that if he kept this secret for even an hour, Elizabeth would consider him a traitor too. He promised to help her, but his eyes were already on the door. He wasn't thinking about mercy, he was thinking about distance from the situation. Far distance. And the next morning, the sun rose on an Ipswich court that was about to be scorched. When Dudley finally broke the news, Elizabeth's reaction wasn't just anger, it was a cold, calculated fury. She didn't just see a pregnant cousin, she saw a biological coup. Because to Elizabeth, the Seymours and the Greys hadn't just made a baby, they had made a claim. And within 48 hours, the toothache bride was traded for a heavy guard and a one-way trip to the Tower of London. The honeymoon was over, and the interrogation was about to begin. Now, this wasn't just a polite chat over tea. Oh no. Elizabeth appointed a high-level commission to tear the couple's story apart. They were interrogated separately, day after day, by men who specialised in finding the cracks in a lie. They wanted the priest. They wanted the witnesses. They wanted the names of every courtier who had winked at the couple in the hallways. But Katherine and Edward held firm. They had no witnesses left alive, and the priest had vanished into the London fog like a ghost. And so, without any viable proof that they wed, the commission declared their marriage invalid and their unborn child a bastard. Elizabeth thought she had won. She thought that by declaring their love illegal, she had killed the Seymour claim. But the Queen had forgotten one little tidbit, and that was that the Tower was as much a marketplace as it was a prison. You see, the lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Edward Warner, was either a hopeless romantic or, more likely, highly susceptible to a well-placed bribe. Edward Seymour began a quiet, gold-plated campaign to reach his wife. A few coins to a warder, a key left in a lock, a guard looking the other way at midnight, et voilà. The strictly separated prisoners were suddenly sharing a bed once more. So in the dead of night, while Elizabeth slept soundly in her own palace, the most high-security prisoners in England were holding a secret honeymoon behind iron bars. It was the ultimate, scandalous middle finger to the Queen's authority. She had locked them in a fortress to stop a bloodline, but had also inadvertently given them the most exclusive, high-security retreat in the kingdom. And as the months ticked by, the Tower was about to reveal one final, devastating secret. The Seymours hadn't just survived their imprisonment, they had doubled down on it. Because Catherine was pregnant. Again. And if the first pregnancy was a scandal, the second? Oh, that was a declaration of war. When the news reached the Queen, she didn't just fume, she went into a state of total, cold-blooded shock. Because to Elizabeth, this wasn't just a lapse in security, it was a mockery of the crown. She immediately fired the Lieutenant of the Tower. Turns out, being a hopeless romantic is a fireable offence when the Queen's throne is on the line. But for Catherine and Edward, the bill for their midnight reunions finally came due. Elizabeth realised that as long as they were under the same roof, even a roof as thick as the Tower's, they were a threat. So she did the one thing she knew would break them. She separated them permanently. Not just by walls, but by counties. Elizabeth had no choice. Catherine had now effectively created an heir and a spare. 2 healthy boys? Yeah, she needed to be rid of them all, and fast. And so, after the birth of the second Tower baby in February 1563, Edward was hauled off to the countryside, while Catherine was carted from one draughty manor to another, kept under the watchful eyes of various guardians who were terrified of the Queen's temper. But the cruelest blow wasn't the distance from her husband, it was the dismantling of her family. Her 2 sons were treated like radioactive assets. Her firstborn, little Edward, was taken away to be raised by his grandmother, while his younger brother Thomas remained with Catherine. Elizabeth was effectively breaking the Seymour line into manageable, isolated pieces. For 7 years, Catherine lived in a gilded cage of isolation. Her letters to Elizabeth became increasingly desperate, filled with apologies and pleas for a mercy that was never going to come. But Elizabeth wasn't being cruel just for the sake of it. She was being a Tudor. She knew that as long as Catherine was alive, and fertile, she was a magnetic north for every rebel in England. To Elizabeth, the boy Catherine had birthed in the Tower wasn't a nephew. He was a bastardized rival who spent his childhood in a legal limbo, his very existence a question mark over the crown. And by 1568, at the age of 27, Catherine's spirit finally broke. She stopped eating, wasting away in a slow, silent protest against a world that had stolen her life. In her final hours at Cockfield Hall, she performed one last act of defiance. She asked her keepers to deliver 3 rings to her beloved Edward: her wedding ring, her betrothal ring, and a 3rd ring featuring a death's head. A final, dark message to the man who had shared her secret bed. As I am, so shall you be. When Katherine Grey finally took her final breath, she did so as a prisoner of her own bloodline. Elizabeth had won. The Grey threat was buried in a quiet country church, and her sons were left to grow up in the shadows of their mother's scandal. Legally illegitimate, socially dangerous, and forever a reminder that in the Tudor court, love isn't a refuge, it's a target. When the news of Catherine's death finally reached Edward, it didn't just break his heart, it left him in a legal and social vacuum. He was a widower whose marriage didn't legally exist, and a father to 2 sons the law called bastards. But Edward was a Seymour, and if there's one thing that family knew how to do, it was wait for the tide to turn. He spent the rest of Elizabeth's reign in a state of quiet, dignified frustration. He eventually regained some of his favour at court, but he never stopped fighting for his children. He spent decades and a small fortune in legal fees trying to prove that the missing priest from that snowy morning in Cannon Row had actually existed. He wanted his sons' legitimacy restored, not just for their sake, but as a final act of devotion to the woman he had risked everything for. He eventually remarried, twice actually, but neither marriage held the scandalous spark of his time with Catherine. It wasn't until Elizabeth was finally in her grave and James I took the throne that Edward got his vindication. James, who understood the pain of having a mother persecuted by Elizabeth, finally legally recognised the marriage. After 40 years, Edward was no longer a disgraced seducer, he was a legitimate widower. And when he finally died at the ripe old age of 81, he left behind a final request that would have made Elizabeth I roll in her tomb. He left instructions for a magnificent monument in Salisbury Cathedral. He didn't want to be buried with his later wives. He wanted to lie next to Catherine. He even had her body moved from her quiet country grave to be placed beside him. There they still lie today, 2 effigies in cold marble, finally together, finally legitimate, and forever a reminder that while queens can dictate the law, they can't always dictate the heart. And so ends our cautionary tale of what happens when true love collides with the cold machinery of the state, and learning the hard way that the only thing more dangerous than being an enemy of the Queen is producing her heir. But not to worry, there's always someone new lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the perfect time to test that theory. Until next time.